Welcome on into the Utah Blockcast. I'm Steve Bartle, Utah Insider for KSL Sports. Good to be with you. I apologize that I've been absent the last two days from the podcast feeds. Been dealing with a little bit of a head cold. As you can probably tell from the sound of my voice, just sound a little different. But appreciate everybody for being patient with me and understanding. Just want to recap some of the things from Monday's press conference and media availability, largely talking about the offense and obviously the defense, which is, two important phases of the game to talk about. Oh man, it's going to be a struggle. I apologize. I am not firing on all cylinders. But again, want to talk about that. Obviously, with Kyle Whittingham, had a lot of things to say at his press conference, and then Morgan Scalley. We had the opportunity to talk to him Monday night, and he owned the performance from Utah's defense Saturday against Kansas State. So, I want to talk through all that. Good grief, man! I've got my water jug. I've got Dayquil. Hoping to power through this. So I appreciate everybody again for being patient with me. And before I get into everything, I want to take a moment and just say thank you to everyone that listens, that watches, everybody that's come up to us, myself, Bennett, Cam, Tyson, all of us. Means a lot to get the shout outs, to meet people that appreciate what we're doing here with the podcast. It's been really cool to meet a lot of people that listen and tune in. And Saturday was a really special day for me because, a lot of people that I wouldn't expect to be, listening in were really cool, who they recognized me and took a moment to say thank you for the podcast, and it was just really cool. And I won't reveal who they were, but pretty cool to have a few of those conversations with people that I did not expect to be listening in. So really cool for me, really cool for the Blockcast, for Bennett, Cam, and Tyson as well. It means a lot to have as many people listening as we do, and also the type of people listening that we do. We've got a lot of great listeners and people that support the Blockcast, and it means a lot. So I wanted to start out by saying thank you to everybody for supporting us and for listening. It really means a lot. So just a really cool experience this past weekend, and I wanted to start by saying thanks. So with that, let's get into some of the comments from Monday. And let's start with Kyle Whittingham and what he had to say about the offense. Obviously, going back to Saturday, 51-47 shootout. I was watching that game and I was like, oh man, Whittingham always talks about you become us, we don't become you, when talking about like recruits and freshmen coming into the program. And I felt like this was a Big 12, a prototypical Big 12 matchup that we've watched, in years past. And I was just thinking about that quote that, man, maybe Utah is becoming Big 12 product. And, for some, that's kind of scary. Certainly a new era for Utah football to get into a shootout like that. But it was certainly entertaining, among other things. Among many other things, to say the least. But here's what Whittingham had to say about Devin Dampier and what he did late in that fourth quarter, which obviously the final 7 minutes were incredible. And Devin Dampier did everything to will Utah to victory, and I think just gave us a really good idea of what he's truly capable of when Utah needs him. And so here's what Whitt had to say about his starting quarterback.
Coach, you lead the country in red zone touchdowns.
We do.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. What is it? It's got to be 80% or better.
82%.
82%, which
above Georgia.
That's huge. That is huge.
Can you talk about Devin Dampier and what he showed in that fourth quarter after battling through kind of a rough game to make the plays that he did?
That's who he is. You talk about a fierce competitor and a guy that never, ever even thinks about getting down on himself or anybody else. He's always positive, and it was manifest in that fourth quarter in particular. And what a great leader he is. I can't say enough good things about him and what he's meant to the program in the short time he's been here.
So there you have it. Kyle Whittingham talking about the impact of Devin Dampier, what he meant to Utah's victory, but also what he's meant to the program, in less than a year of time that he's been in Salt Lake City. And I think that's something that I hope Dev gets more credit for. He's meant a lot to the program in terms of turning the vibes around. We've talked a lot the last week or so about, last year and what it was like last year, the experience last year for Utah fans. It was a really difficult experience. It was a really difficult experience for people in the program as well. 7-game losing streak for the first time in God knows how many years. It's been a long time since Utah struggled like that. And the vibes weren't great. But I think Devin came into the program and was instrumental in regards to, sort of reinstilling that confidence and swagger, particularly on that offensive side of the ball. Last year's struggles primarily stemmed from the offense, and that can have a pretty tough impact on players and their belief in how they're able to perform. And I think Dev came in and just brought a swagger and an energy that I think this team and this program needed. And so, I hope Dev gets the credit he deserves for that. And I don't think he's getting the credit he deserves for that. He's been instrumental in turning the vibes around for this program in such a short amount of time. Just his confidence and what he's meant to the teammates around him. He's all about his teammates. Every time he's asked about certain things, he deflects and gives credit elsewhere, and it's really impressive. And I think that's the sort of leadership that Utah needed this year to right the ship. Devin has been really vital to that, and I think one of the things that was really, really encouraging from Saturday's performance beyond what he did in crunch time was what he did as a passer. And there's been a lot of criticism for Dampier this season in regards to his deep ball specifically, and I think it was the deep ball specifically Saturday night that was a key factor in Utah's offensive performance overall, but particularly down the stretch. Utah needed a couple big plays, and Devin stepped up to deliver a couple of darts, which were 20-plus yard throws. Obviously, the Larry Simmons touchdown was put right on the money, and when you look at his numbers from this past week, he finished 4-7 on throws of at least 20 yards and really did a lot. He now, I think, has 7 more passes to the deep parts of the field of 20-plus yards. He has 7 more passes to that area of the field than he does behind the line of scrimmage. And I think there's been a lot of talk about, his completion percentage is inflated because he's just completing passes, around the line of scrimmage, behind the line of scrimmage, a lot of easy passes. And, for a while that was very much the case. But you look at his pass distribution now, and I think he's got 12% of his passes behind the line of scrimmage. Still, the bulk of those are, in the short and intermediate parts, but, the deep ball now is, I think, right around 24% of his distribution. And I think that's a really good number for him, and it's allowed him to, I think that's something that we've seen kind of emerge, specifically a lot Saturday night against Kansas State, connecting on 4 deep passes, and obviously the pass to J.J. Buchanan and a couple to Larry Simmons really did a lot to help Utah. Utah finished with 5 big passing plays, explosive passing plays, with a pass to Dallin Bentley for a touchdown, the other to Larry Simmons as well, and then obviously J.J. Buchanan with the big one as well. But I think that was a really encouraging thing for Dampier, and I think it speaks to the emerging chemistry that he's developed with some of these other guys. And a credit to Creed Whittemore and Ryan and Larry Simmons for stepping up in place of Ryan Davis, who and we'll talk a little bit more about here in a little bit. But really encouraged by what we saw from Creed and from Larry. Obviously, Larry with the touchdown grab, an acrobatic catch, which is he's just so good. Those acrobatic catches, those toe tap catches, man, he is money in those situations. And Creed stepping up in place of Ryan Davis specifically to kind of fill that chain mover role, right? He finished with 5 receptions for 51 yards, and I think converted three first downs on those 5 receptions. And I think that's going to be really important for him to continue to fill that role as being that reliable outlet for Dampier. And so it was really encouraging to see that from him. So I think Utah, got a couple of encouraging performances, a couple of really encouraging developments with the offensive performances from Saturday night. Some big question marks around the offense all season long, the deep ball, who was going to step up at wide receiver, and Utah got some answers Saturday night. They're going to need that again Friday against Kansas probably, but really encouraging to see that from Dampier. And obviously, I hope that people give him enough credit for and understand that he has not been 100%. He has been limited, and he's still willing to go out there, put it all on the line for his teammates. And I think that says a lot, and it means a lot to his teammates and why they're willing to go to bat for him time and time again. So overall, a great offensive performance by Utah Saturday night, especially Saturday night. Saturday day was solid too, but Saturday night was really, really special. Finished with 551 yards overall, 259 through the air, 292 on the ground. Dampier was fantastic, 259 through the air, 2 touchdowns through the air. Only a 55% completion rate, but again, was really, really good on that deep ball. I think he completed 4 or 7 passes of at least 20 yards, so it was just really impressive. Run game continuing to do what it did. Wayshawn touching 100. Devin Dampier adding 94 more yards with the big run, 59 late in the game, just clutch. And again, the pass catching production, 51 yards for Creed, 54 for Larry. Dallin Bentley, 54 yards and a touchdown as well. And, unfortunately just missed a couple other, passes from Dev early on in that game. But he could have had a much bigger game as well. And then J.J. Buchanan, 2 of 6 receptions, 2 receptions on 6 targets. Would love to see that improve. I think, when you start talking about the offseason and guys that can really take a big step forward next year, I think J.J. Buchanan is at the top of the list. I think he's got a lot of potential as well. So, and then too, I think a surprising performance, on Saturday was Nate Johnson and some of the volume we saw from him. He finished with four rushes for 33 yards, added a reception early on in that game for 16 yards. He was pretty involved early on, and I think that was really good to see as well. Now, to contrast that with the defense, pretty rough day for the defense, and we had the opportunity to talk to Morgan Scalley on Monday night, and he owned it. He knows what Saturday was, and he didn't shy away from it. He owned it. So here's what Coach Scalley had to say.
Obviously, will always be on me. So bottom line is we got to look at the film. We weren't good enough gap fits, not good enough tackling. There's a lot wrong, and it's on me. It's on me. So other than that, it was an embarrassment, and credit really to their offensive staff. Wells, heck of a job. And, that happens in this profession. Unfortunately, it happened right there. And, you got a thick chin, you got to bounce back, and we got fighters. So I'm excited for this week. So we got great kids that are fighters. The 4-minute drill, getting a stop, that 2-point conversion interception was huge, and then for Lander to end it.
Morgan had a lot to say, and again, that was a clip that was kind of cut down, trimmed down a little bit, and Morgan owned Saturday night's mishaps, and just said that he time and time again he said throughout the availability that it was on him, that he didn't have the guys prepared as well prepared as he should have, and he owns that. And I think there's a lot of motivation for that Utah defense to bounce back this week. We had the opportunity to talk to Jonathan Hall as well, and he echoed the same sentiment. He said, "Look, like, we did not play our best, and we know that we've got to bounce back. We're fighters, and we're gonna make the improvements that we need to." And I think that's going to be key this week because you've got a Kansas squad that likes to run the ball as well. They've got a dual threat quarterback in Jalen Daniels and a rushing attack that's pretty solid. And so Lance Leopold also said that they feel like they can replicate what some of Kansas State did. So this is going to be a test, and Kansas is going to want to take it to Utah. And it's going to be up to Morgan Scalley and that defense to prove themselves against the run this week. So I think that's going to be a really important element for Utah. And I think, again, this going back to Saturday night, giving up, what was it, almost 500 yards rushing, 472 to be specific, 293 to Joe Jackson specifically, 3 touchdowns as well. He had a number of big runs, including a long of 80 yards. Kansas State finishing with 574 total overall. And so I think this is going to be a big thing for Utah this week, is bouncing back and doing so in pretty emphatic fashion. And I think, this is going to be a really kind of big moment for the defense, is, stopping the run, stifling the Kansas Jayhawk attack. And Utah's going to need their defensive front specifically to have a big bounce back performance. They're going to need their interior tackles to control the line of scrimmage. I think that was where Utah lost the game against Kansas State, was the defensive line didn't get the knockback that they needed to. They didn't control the line of scrimmage to give their backers the space and timing they needed to fit the gap specifically. The defensive line, it's not that they were getting pushed back off the ball a couple yards, but they weren't, they were getting pushed back by a yard. And Kansas State offensive line did a great job. I don't know how much I saw A-gap power on the Kansas State film throughout the season, but credit to them for coming in with a unique game plan. And much like Utah did to UCLA with Joe Williams all those years ago, you remember that game because Utah brought in that counter trade run play that I think UCLA wasn't fully prepared for. And, sometimes that's going to happen. And it was kind of my biggest worry going into the game. I know that Kansas State is a much better program than Oklahoma State, but watching that team struggle against OSU, I just had a feeling that Kansas State was spending a little bit extra time preparing for Utah, and based on what we saw Saturday night, I feel confident. I feel pretty confident that was the case. So Utah took Kansas State's best punch and continued to punch back, and I think that's the big thing. And it's an embodiment of Kyle Whittingham and what he's built this program upon. It's that toughness, it's that physicality, and that never die attitude, and that's what we saw from the defense Saturday night. But certainly, moving forward, you don't want to have that same sort of performance again Friday, and so it's going to be imperative that Utah's defense, tightens things up, and specifically up front with the defensive line controlling the line of scrimmage. Again, I think that was the big issue, and just compounded things for everybody else. And obviously we can talk about adjustments and Morgan Scalley potentially, phasing out of man coverage and going into more zone coverage to compensate. But I think overall what you would rather see is Utah get back to playing with the physicality they need to, controlling the line of scrimmage and all of that to allow them continue to do what they do best, and that's man coverage. So that's sort of the battle. That's sort of the chess match, right, with these coaches and offensive coordinators, defensive coordinators, and the back and forth battle. You don't want to get out of what you do best. You want to continue to do that, and I think that's going to be key for Utah this week. So it's all about, again, kind of reestablishing your dominance in the trenches, and that's going to be pretty imperative for that tackle group specifically, in my opinion. So last thing for me here on this episode. Whittingham talked about a few things with regards to the roster, and first and foremost were a couple of injuries that Utah suffered Saturday. And the unfortunate news is that John Henry Daly is lost for the season. And I think it's the type of injury, I haven't confirmed what it is, but what I've heard is an Achilles tear. And we know that that's a pretty significant injury. And so it's the type of injury with the timing and where this happened for JHD that it might ultimately cost him next season as well, which is a significant bummer for him and for Utah. JHD was having a great game. 2 sacks, 3.5 tackles for loss overall within the first quarter. He was on a tear, and unfortunately suffered that injury, had to leave, and just a really brutal, devastating injury for him and for Utah. But what we saw was Cash Dillon, Lance Holtzclaw stepping up in his place, and though the playmaking wasn't there, we saw Logan Fano step up. I think he finished with 4 pressures and a sack overall. So he kind of picked up some of the slack, and I think that's going to be important for him and for this Utah defense as you incorporate Cash and Lance a little bit more. Is you're going to need Logan to step up and be more of that playmaker than complement to JHD. JHD was a unique defensive end. His get off, his motor, his quickness, his ability to bend around the corner, those were all great qualities that he possesses as an edge rusher. And these other guys with Cash and Lance, they've got their own strength. Cash is a little bit different. He's a little bit more physical. He's a well-built kid. He's strong. He's stout. And I think he's going to help Utah specifically quite a bit in defending the run. But I think with him on the field, again, you're going to need others to step up as playmakers. And I think that's going to be key for Logan and Lance to take that on as well. So excited to see what this group does. Cash has been really productive in the minimal opportunities that he's had. Lance as well. And with this game against Kansas on Friday, it's going to be really important for them to really step up as well. The other injury that has not been talked about as much is Ryan Davis, and it's still unconfirmed officially, but heard it was a pretty significant injury for him as well. We didn't see him Saturday after a couple of passes early on in that game, and we saw Creed and Larry step up for him, and that's going to continue to be the case. I think this week is those guys continuing to play a pretty significant role for Utah in that wide receiver room without Ryan Davis, but we will obviously await the availability report, which will debut tonight. So because it's a Friday game, the initial report will debut a day earlier. Now, there were a couple other things that he talked about, and there was a lot of talk about, I shouldn't say a lot, but there were some comments about the portal and roster construction and roster management. And, one thing he said was, it's a radical departure from what it used to be. And that's very much the case. Where programs were keeping 80 to 90% of their roster year over year sometimes, that's now you're hoping for 40 to 50%, 60% some years. And I think Utah is in a situation this year where you can kind of count on the bulk of your roster coming back. I think it's going to be really important for Utah to keep hold of this group. It's a young group, and I think there's a couple position groups where they really added some promising youth too that will take the flag. From a couple of veteran groups, and looking at that defensive tackle room and linebacker room specifically, there's a couple of young guys in each of those rooms that I think are set to take bigger steps. Take on bigger roles going into next season. And, this is going to be a key for Utah, is developing these young players and holding on to them. And that's going to be the key. So I think, with the portal, again, it's moved from December to January. So I think that's going to be a really important thing for a program like Utah to have that extra month, to have the conversations, to talk through what the future will hold for each of their players. They're going to have those exit meetings, and they're going to be able to talk through frustrations, desires, goals going into 2026. And I think that's going to help Utah maintain, a lot of roster continuity year over year. I think this is a big improvement for college football, is having the transfer portal window in January. And I think having the one transfer portal window in January, I think, is going to be really helpful as well. So instead of having those two windows like we did last year, where it's, it was just kind of crazy and hectic all offseason, I think having one is going to do a lot to kind of, minimize the chaos of roster construction. So getting into next season's roster, obviously you start at that quarterback position. Again, Utah would love to have both Dev and Bird back next year. And from what I've heard, I think there's a good chance that Utah will have the funds available to bring them both back. It's just a matter of the two wanting to come back together, and I think that's going to be really interesting as that quarterback spot with those two. I think they found a good harmony, and I think for Bird, to establish himself as he has in year one is really significant for his future. He now becomes a pretty big priority for Utah moving forward, and I think if Utah can bring both back, I think that would be tremendous to help Dev, have that senior leadership, and then for Bird to have another year to work in the offense, I think would be huge. So ideally, Utah is able to bring both of those guys back. At running back, you're going to lose Nakari Rogers because he's a senior. Bringing Wayshawn back will be vital. If you can hang on to Daniel Bray and bring in LaMarcus Bell, and you get a year of development for Racing Guillory, that running back room looks really promising again next year. Wide receiver, right? You look at that group, you're going to say goodbye to Ryan Davis, but you're going to be able to bring back the bulk of that group and potentially add a couple of really dynamite receivers in the Pula twins. And suddenly that group looks a little bit better with some of the talent in that room. There's going to be probably some changes made through the portal in that room as well. And I think Utah has a really bright opportunity at that spot specifically, both in terms of the guys that they have in the room now that can potentially develop into something, the guys that they're bringing in as freshmen, and then what they could potentially add through the portal. I think Utah can do a lot to help that wide receiver room going into 2026. You look at tight end, you're going to potentially lose Dallin Bentley. There's talk of him potentially getting a red shirt, but I think it's most likely that he is gone, and he's had a fantastic year. And I think Utah continues to prove that they can develop tight ends, they can utilize tight ends, and they love their tight ends. And I think that's a big deal for Utah going into next season. You're going to need somebody to step up, and you get Hunter Andrews back, who can kind of be that, you back type of role like Brant Keithy, but who's going to be that traditional wide tight end? That's going to be the big question mark for me. At offensive line, obviously Spencer Fano is going to be going on to the NFL. I think that's obvious. You lose your veterans along the interior and Jaron Kump and Tanoa Togiai and Michael Mokafisi. There's potentially you bring Caleb Lomu back, and I think with him. He's got a lot of encouraging evaluations of him, but I think there's a real possibility that if he comes back, he can turn himself into a top 5, top 10 lock next year. He has the sort of potential where he could be a first-round pick this year, but I think if he comes back another year and has that third year like Spencer did this year, I think that's going to do a lot to solidify his first-round status and really potentially put him in a situation that could be quite good. So I think there's a decent chance that Utah is able to bring back Caleb Lomu, and I think that would be priority number one for Utah, regardless of position. I think if you can get back Lomu, that would do a lot for your offensive line because you're bringing in a very talented freshman in Kelvin Obot who can play that right tackle spot. You've got a group of linemen that have been in the program a really long time now that you're also going to have back next year. So even though this group is going to look a lot different, there's still potential for it to be another good position group next year. But obviously, a lot has to work out for that to be the case. So if you can bring Lomu back, if Kelvin Obot can come in and prove to be a day one impact guy, You've got some other pieces to play with, and Keith Olson and Solatoa Mogiai. You've got Alex Harrison, Kalolo Ta'aga, who transferred in last year as well. You've got some pieces in that room. Ike Garcia as well, potentially. So, that group is obviously the biggest question mark, but I think there's still some avenues for Utah to bring back a pretty solid offensive line unit. Getting to the defense side of the ball, obviously, we'll see what happens with JHD, but hard to count on him in 2026. But you still got Cash Dillon, you've got Lance Holsclaw, you got Jackson Jones, who's been basically redshirting this year, even though he redshirted at Oregon the year before. But he's a guy that I think can emerge as a pass rusher. You could potentially bring back Logan Fano. You've got the defensive tackle room that has those 5 freshmen that are going to be developing, and Utah feels really good about the development of all those guys. I think that's going to be a group that should be solid. It'll certainly be different than what we've seen this year, but I think it has the potential to really, be a solid unit yet again. At linebacker, you're going to be losing Lander and you're going to be losing Levani. Can you hang on to Jono and Trey? Can you bring up some of these young guys and Cyrus Polu and Elijah Ellis and Christian Thatcher? Can you develop those guys to be able to have them step in right away? In the defensive secondary, you've got Scooby, you've got Donovan Saunders who can come back, you've got Smith Snowden and Teo Johnson who could potentially come back, Rabbit Evans as well. That secondary has potential to be pretty good as well. So I say all this to kind of talk about the future looks really solid. There's going to be a couple of key pieces that Utah has to bring back in order to really solidify that outlook. But I think there's potential for that to be the case, for it to play out that way. So I think there's reason to be optimistic about 2026 and what that can mean for Utah in terms of their roster. But again, going to need a couple key pieces to return for sure. So overall, man, I think Kyle Whittingham talked about it, but there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about a number of guys in that room, and Utah's done a fantastic job of evaluating players that fit their scheme. And he highlighted Blake Cotton as a guy that when you look at the transfer portal ledger, Utah's got a lot of positives in terms of guys that they made bets on and they're getting positive returns on, and Blake Cotton is one of those guys, and that's going to need to continue. And for Utah, they've done a good job of being prepared, right, for what's to come. And I think Utah's current roster situation, based on what we know right now, they'll go into the transfer portal window without significant needs, certainly some wants, but without significant needs, unlike last year. And I think that'll be really interesting to see how they elect to utilize the transfer portal come January, because they can be selective and they can be a little bit more selective in terms of who they go after and who they prioritize in the transfer portal and what they prioritize in the transfer portal. But at the very least, I know that Utah will be prepared regardless of what comes up. So I'll man, I'm out of breath. I'll go ahead. I'll wrap this one up and I'll hopefully have another episode out tomorrow, and then again Thursday, Friday, we'll see with Thanksgiving. But again, I want to say give a big thanks to everybody that tunes in. I appreciate everybody, and I'll go ahead and sign off.